Hello, y'all. It's Dr. G. As the 1960s turned into the decade of the 1970s, America seemed to be stumbling. It was a period that has often been dubbed the me decade, a time of oil shocks, Watergate, and a gnawing sense that the American century, with its boundless optimism and its post war prosperity, was perhaps unraveling. As our textbook describes, the preceding 1960s as a decade of immense hope, but also as profound strife, tragedy, and chaos. That turbulence didn't simply vanish with the changing of the calendar, it bled directly into, and in many ways defined, the 1970s. To understand this unraveling, we need to look back at the threads that wove the tapestry of post war America, threads that began to fray and snap in the 1970s. The unraveling, then, as our textbook calls it, in the 1970s was not a sudden snap, but an acceleration of fissures already present. The racial inequalities papered over by post war prosperity, the economic model critiqued by Galbraith for its focus on private wealth over the public good, and the Cold War consensus that bred internal anxieties and foreign policy quagmires like Vietnam. All of these were pre existing conditions. Furthermore, the very movements that sought to fulfill American ideals, civil rights, the women's rights, and others in their ilk, also contributed to the unraveling of a singular, white, male dominated vision of America. As diverse groups found their voices and demanded their rights, they challenged not just for a piece of the existing pie, but questioned the recipe itself, leading to a sense of fragmentation for those invested in the old order. So here we go. Let's delve into the decade of disillusionment and transformation, the unraveling 1970s. As the 1970s dawned, a dark shadow continued: the Vietnam War. American involvement, which began as a Cold War strategy to contain communism, had escalated dramatically in the 1960s, especially under President Lyndon B. Johnson, becoming a deeply divisive and increasingly unpopular conflict by 1968. Richard Nixon, the next president, inherited this quagmire, promising peace with honor. His strategy involved what he called Vietnamization, shifting the ground combat burden from American forces to South Vietnamese forces, while simultaneously and paradoxically intensifying the American air war with devastating bombing campaigns across Vietnam and also illegally in Cambodia and Laos. Despite these efforts, the war dragged on, and a bleeding wound on the American psyche until the final, humiliating fall of Saigon in April of 1975. The images of desperate Vietnamese civilians clinging to American helicopters lifting off from the embassy roof became an indelible symbol of American failure, a stark illustration of the limits of American power on the world stage. Back home, the war's cost was measured not just in lives and dollars, but in the erosion of trust between the American people and their government. The 1971 publication of the Pentagon Papers, a top secret Department of Defense study of the U.S. political and military involvement in Vietnam from 1945 to 1967, revealed a long history of government deception regarding the war's progress and prospects. This bombshell report landed on a public already skeptical after years of official pronouncements that continued to say that this war, the light was at the end of the tunnel. And these pronouncements contradict the grim realities reported on nightly television. The very origins of major escalations, such as the Gulf of Tonkin incident in 1964, were shrouded in controversy, with doubts emerging later about the veracity of the reported attacks that led to the Gulf of Tonkin resolution, which had granted President Johnson broad authority to wage war. This credibility gap became a chasm. For the soldiers who fought in Vietnam, the return home was fraught with incredible difficulty. Unlike the celebrated heroes of World War I or World War II, Vietnam veterans came back to a nation deeply divided over the war they had fought. Many faced indifference, even hostility, and often lacked the adequate support system to deal with the psychic and physical wounds of a brutal and morally ambiguous conflict. The oral histories of veterans like George M. Garcia, a Marine corporal who served in Vietnam, provides a glimpse into these personal tolls. The early life in Texas, the harrowing combat experiences, and the disorienting return to a changed and charged America. The anti-war movement, which had reached its zenith in the late 1960s with massive protests, had fundamentally altered how Americans viewed their government's foreign policy. While large-scale mobilizations might have waned in the early 1970s as troop withdrawals began and more troops started coming home, the sentiment of opposition and disillusionment towards the war lingered, deeply embedding itself in the national consciousness. More than just a political or a military crisis, Vietnam became a profound moral crisis at home for many Americans. If you recall from last episode, years earlier, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. had powerfully predicted this in 1967 when he gave his Beyond Vietnam speech. And if you haven't listened to it, go listen to his speech. He argued that the war was not only unjust and unwinnable, but was also a betrayal of the United States and its ideals, diverting the critical resources and attention needed for pressing domestic problems like poverty and racial injustice, and sent them to fight an unwinnable war. If you'll recall, this speech in 1967 made Dr. King public enemy number one, but this moral critique connecting the war abroad to injustice at home actually happened. And it resonated now deeply, and it would continue to haunt the nation throughout the 1970s. Another powerful voice of dissent was Muhammad Ali. In 1967, if you recall, the heavyweight boxing champion refused to be inducted in the U.S. Army, famously stating, "I ain't got no quarrel with those Viet Cong," end quote. Ali, who was a member at the time of the Nation of Islam, cited his religious beliefs as forbidding him from participating in the war. The stand cost him his title and the right to box for over 3 years, and it also made him a potent symbol of both anti-war sentiment as well as black resistance to a draft that had disproportionately sent young black men to fight and die for a country that still denied them full citizenship and equality. The Vietnam War, therefore, was more than a foreign policy failure. It was a primary catalyst in the unraveling of the post-World War II Cold War consensus and the myth of American exceptionalism. The initial justifications for intervention, rooted in domino theory and the containment of communism that we looked at in an earlier episode, crumbled under the weight of television brutality, under the dubious premises like the Gulf of Tonkin incidents, and even the official deceptions that were laid bare by the Pentagon Papers. This erosion of faith extended beyond the war itself to the broader questions of American foreign policy and the inherent righteousness of American intentions. This loss of faith was profound, and it would hold still to this day. Furthermore, the immense economic cost of the war, as Dr. King had highlighted, directly contributed to the economic instability that would plague the 1970s. The Johnson administration and its attempt to finance both his ambitious Great Society domestic programs and the escalating war in Vietnam without tax increases, the guns and butter approach, proved unsustainable, and it fueled inflation and it diverted vast resources needed at home. King's stark calculation that the nation spent approximately $500,000 to kill enemy soldier, while we spent only $53 for each son classified as poor, end quote, vividly illustrates the disastrous miscalculation and misallocation of national wealth, the consequences of which would be painfully felt in the stagflation and misery index in the 1970s, something we'll look at in a moment. This further unraveled the promises of the affluent society. The seismic shifts of the 1960s civil rights movement continued to reverberate through the 1970s, but the landscape of activism had completely changed. The early movement, characterized by its commitment to nonviolent direct action from the Greensboro sit-ins that began in the 60s to the courageous freedom rides that challenged segregated interstate travel, and the major campaigns in Birmingham and Selma, had achieved landmark legislative victories: the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965, monumental achievements, dismantling legal segregation and ostensibly guaranteeing Black Americans the right to vote. Yet, for many, the pace of change was agonizingly slow, and the persistence of violence and systemic discrimination bred frustration and a search for new strategies. And this frustration found its most potent expression in the call for Black power. The slogan was famously popularized by Stokely Carmichael, who would change his name to Kwame Ture, and he said this during the March Against Fear in Mississippi in June of 1966. This was more than just a rhetorical shift. It signaled a significant evolution in Black political thought. The SNCC, once a leading proponent of nonviolence and interracial cooperation, began to expel its white members and pivot its focus from integrationist efforts in the rural South to addressing the deep-seated injustices faced by African Americans in northern urban centers. So this directly challenged the integrationist goals that had largely defined an earlier phase of the movement. As Carmichael put it in 1966, quote, "It's time out for nice words. It's time Black people got together. We have to define how we are going to move, not how they say we can move," end quote. The intellectual and spiritual godfather of much of the Black Power sentiment was Malcolm X. Though assassinated in 1965, his philosophy of self-defense, Black nationalism, and his critiques of American racism, including what he termed, quote, token integration, resonated powerfully now with the new generation that grew up in the activist circles of the 1960s. Malcolm X urged African Americans to pursue freedom, equality, and justice by any means necessary. His eventual break with the Nation of Islam and his subsequent embrace of Sunni Islam and Pan-Africanism before his death also indicated an evolving, dynamic intellectual journey, one that increasingly saw the African American struggle not just as a domestic United States struggle, but a struggle in the global context. Perhaps the most visible, scariest, and probably the most controversial, if not the most misunderstood, of the Black Power movement was the Black Panther Party for Self-Defense, founded in Oakland, California in October 1966 by Huey P. Newton and Bobby Seale. The Panthers became iconic for their direct action tactics, including armed monitoring of police activity in Black communities, and their advocacy for community control. Their 10-point program was a comprehensive platform demanding fundamental changes. Quote, "We want freedom. We want power to determine the destiny of our Black community," is how it began, going on to call for full employment, decent housing, and education that taught, quote, "our true history." They wanted an end to police brutality, and they wanted an exemption for Black men from military service. Beyond their militant image, the Black Panther Party was deeply involved in community organizing, establishing what they called survival programs. They had free breakfast for children, Black and white, as well as free health clinics and sickle cell anemia screening, all things that were denied to them or not deemed important in the general public. And it demonstrated a holistic approach to empowerment. Key figures like Eldridge Cleaver, who served as Minister of Information, and the charismatic young leader Fred Hampton in Chicago further amplified the party's message and reach. The rise of these more assertive Black organizations, however, drew an aggressive and often illegal response from the U.S. government. The FBI's counterintelligence program, or COINTELPRO, which began in the 1950s against the Communist Party, was expanded in the 1960s to target a wide range of domestic groups. However, the majority of that was a focus on Black liberation movements. Its goals regarding Black activist groups including the, quote, prevention the coalition of militant Black nationalist groups to prevent the rise of a messiah who could unify the militant Black nationalist movement, and to pinpoint potential troublemakers and neutralize them, end quote. Neutralize in this case means kill. COINTELPRO employed tactics such as infiltration by informants, spreading disinformation, forging documents, instigating rivalries between groups, legal harassment, and even involvement in violence and assassination. The Black Panther Party was one of its prime targets, leading to numerous arrests, trials, as well as the FBI's assassination of the leader Fred Hampton and Mark Clark in 1969, a Chicago raid that was later to have found FBI involvement. The 1970s saw that the energy and the strategies from the Black freedom struggle within the 1960s and into the 1970s, inspiring other marginalized groups to find their voice and organize for their rights during the 1970s. This included the Chicano movement, with its deep roots in earlier Mexican American civil rights activism, and they gained significant momentum. Activists proudly reclaimed the term Chicano, previously only really used as a pejorative, and to forge a unified identity and campaign for political, social, and economic justice, to not be second-class citizens. They confronted discrimination in schools, politics, and particularly in the agricultural sector. They realized that their plight was similar to Black Americans. Cesar Chavez became a most recognizable figure in this movement. Alongside Dolores Huerta, he co-founded the National Farm Workers Association, which later became the United Farm Workers. Employing nonviolent tactics inspired by Gandhi and later Martin Luther King Jr., they enacted boycotts, most famously the Delano grape strike and boycott. And they also had hunger strikes and long protest marches. Chavez and the UFW fought for better wages and working conditions for predominantly Mexican and Filipino farm workers in California. Their struggle drew national attention and support, highlighting the exploitation endemic in American agriculture. This fight echoed the earlier testimony of migrant workers like Juanita Garcia, who we saw in 1952, described to Congress the dire conditions, the low wages, and the overwhelming power of these companies. Another key Chicano activist was Corky Gonzalez, who founded the Crusade for Justice in Denver in 1966. Native Americans also intensified their struggle for rights and sovereignty through the Red Power movement. Inspired by the civil rights movement and growing grassroots activism, frustrated Native American students formed the National Indian Youth Council in 1961 to draw attention to the myriad of challenges facing indigenous communities. They organized fish-ins in the Pacific Northwest to assert treaty fishing rights, and they directly challenging state conservation laws. These groups included the occupation of the abandoned Alcatraz Island in San Francisco Bay from November 69 to June 71, which powerfully symbolized the reclaiming of native land and the demand for justice. In 1973, the American Indian Movement, or AIM, and other activists occupied the town of Wounded Knee, South Dakota, the site of the infamous 1890 massacre of Lakota Sioux by the U.S. Army. The 71-day standoff with federal authorities drew global attention to Native American grievances and the long history of broken treaties and oppression. Despite the legal victories of this civil rights movement itself, the 1970s still were profoundly shaped by the legacies of segregation and the ongoing resistance to racial equality despite legal victories. The battle for school desegregation, which had been mandated by the Supreme Court in 1954, was far from over. The Little Rock Central High School crisis in '57, when President Eisenhower had to deploy federal troops to enforce the integration of 9 black students against the defiance of Arkansas Governor Orville Faubus, remained a stark reminder of the depths of white resistance. By 1970, there were still some schools that had refused to integrate, showing that the problem had itself not gone away. Beyond schools, housing discrimination remained a formidable barrier to black advancement. Federal policies, ironically often created during the New Deal and expanded post-World War II to promote home ownership, systematically excluded African Americans. In our previous episodes, we had talked about redlining as well as the racially restrictive covenants in deeds which barred non whites from purchasing homes in many new whites only suburban developments, and these lasted on the books for decades. The iconic Levitt towns, the symbols of post war suburban American dream, were initially built exclusively for white families, with William Levitt openly stating his exclusionary politics. As historian Richard Rothstein has argued, these were not merely private prejudice, but a deliberate policy that actively created and reinforced residential segregation. End quote. The fragmentation of the civil rights movement into these diverse power movements was not simply a dissolution of a unified front. Instead, it represented a diversification of tactics and, crucially, a deepening critique of American society. The focus shifted from demanding inclusion within existing structures to demanding a fundamental systemic change and self-determination. Persistent resistance to integration, the slow pace of tangible improvements in the lives of many Black Americans, and the growing awareness of deep-seated issues like redlining and the covert government repression exemplified by COINTELPRO, led many activists to conclude that mere legal equality was insufficient. Figures like Carmichael and the Black Panther Party began to articulate the need for Black people to control their own institutions and communities, a more radical departure than earlier calls for desegregation. The government's response, particularly through COINTELPRO, inadvertently exposed the fragility of democratic norms when confronted by demands for radical social justice. The FBI's use of infiltration, misinformation, and incitement to violence against groups like the Black Panther Party was profoundly undemocratic and often illegal. As details of these programs emerged, they revealed a government willing to subvert constitutional rights to maintain the existing social order. There was a whole committee about this, known as the Church Committee, and the investigations in the Church Committee confirmed this. The hypocrisy, a nation preaching democracy while practicing repression against its own citizens fighting for justice, contributed significantly to the era's widespread disillusionment, the unraveling of faith in the government institutions. Furthermore, the struggles for racial and ethnic justice in the 1970s became inextricably linked with economic justice. Groups increasingly recognized that political and civil rights were hollow without addressing the economic exploitation and the denial of economic opportunity. The Black Panther Party's 10-point program, for instance, included demands for full employment and decent housing. Cesar Chavez and the UFW fought for living wages and humane conditions for farm workers. This focus on economic empowerment acknowledged that the legacies of slavery and Jim Crow and the ongoing discriminatory practices like redlining had created profound economic disparities that civil rights legislation alone could not erase. This understanding had been mentioned a decade earlier. This was stuff brought up by Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., especially in his later work, particularly as he conceptualized the Poor People's Campaign, which sought to unite impoverished peoples of all races to demand economic justice. The fight for rights in the 1970s was increasingly a fight for economic survival and dignity. Let's turn our attention to the president that began the 1970s, Richard Milhous Nixon. Now, his presidency spanned from 1969 to his dramatic resignation in 1974, and it encapsulates many of the contradictions and crises of the 1970s itself. His election in 1968 was, in part, a product of the conservative backlash against the 1960s liberalism, the perceived chaos and excesses of the activism and the counterculture. Nixon's appeal to what he famously termed the silent majority, those Americans weary of the protests, the social upheavals, the civil rights battles, and the ongoing war in Vietnam, those who yearned for a restoration of law and order. This sentiment reflected a broader conservative turn happening in the country, one that had been foreshadowed by Barry Goldwater's unapologetic conservative presidential campaign in 1964. Though Goldwater lost decisively, his pronouncement, extremism in the defense of liberty is no vice, end quote, had laid the important ideological groundwork for the future rise of the new right. Nixon's administration, while often defined by the Watergate scandal, and rightfully so, did oversee significant policy initiatives. He pursued détente with the Soviet Union and achieved a historic opening to Communist China. Domestically, his administration saw the creation of the Environmental Protection Agency, the EPA, and the passage of landmark environmental legislation. However, these achievements were overshadowed by a darker side. He had a deep-seated paranoia, a willingness to use government power against perceived enemies, and an expansion of the kind of covert tactics previously seen in programs like COINTELPRO. The defining event of Nixon's presidency and a critical moment in this unraveling of the American faith in government was the Watergate scandal. It began seemingly small with a June 1972 break-in at the Democratic National Committee headquarters in the Watergate office complex in Washington, D.C. Any scandal after this is something gate after Watergate. What followed was a slow, agonizing revelation of a vast cover-up orchestrated at the highest levels of the White House. Over 2 years, through dogged investigative journalism, tense congressional hearings, and legal battles that went all the way up to the Supreme Court, the details finally emerged. Illegal wiretapping, political espionage, dirty trick campaigns against opponents, hush money, and the obstruction of justice. Key phrases from the era, like Nixon's defiant declaration, quote, "I am not a crook," became ingrained in the national lexicon. The discovery of a secret White House taping system and the subsequent fight over those tapes proved in the end to be Nixon's undoing. Facing certain impeachment by the House of Representatives and conviction later in the Senate, Nixon announced his resignation on August 8, 1974, effectively to the following day, the first and only American president to resign. The Watergate scandal was a profound trauma on the nation. It wasn't just about, quote, a third-rate burglary, as Nixon's press secretary had initially dismissed it. It was a crisis of legitimacy that struck at the heart of American democracy, revealing a disturbing abuse of presidential power and contempt for the rule of law from a president. The scandal unfolded against the backdrop of an unwinnable Vietnam War, another source of deep public disillusionment. The expansion of presidential power, often justified by the necessities of the Cold War, from Kennedy's handling of the Cuban Missile Crisis to Johnson's escalation in Vietnam following the Gulf of Tonkin, had created what historians termed, quote, an imperial presidency. Nixon inherited this powerful executive office and, driven by a siege mentality and a desire to vanquish his political enemies, real or imagined, turned his instruments of power inward. It became us versus them, and that was his worldview, honed in the crucible of Cold War geopolitics and the divisive Vietnamese conflict. And this was applied to then domestic dissent at home, leading directly to the abuses of Watergate. The conservative backlash that had helped Nixon to power was itself a reaction to the transformative social movements of the 1960s. The civil rights movement, anti-war protests, the rise of a counterculture, the growth of the feminist movement had fundamentally challenged the existing social order. For many Americans, these rapid changes were deeply unsettling, creating a sense of anxiety that their values and their way of life were under attack. The silent majority, as Nixon, skillfully tapped into, made this unease a reality. The 1970s thus became an arena for an ongoing struggle between these forces of change and a powerful counter-reaction aiming to restore the perceived traditional order. It was a direct consequence of the 1960s having unraveled the old consensus. After Nixon's resignation, his successor, Gerald Ford, ascended to the presidency under unprecedented circumstances. He was never elected to be vice president or president. One of Ford's first major acts once he became president was to grant Nixon a, quote, full, free, and absolute pardon for any crimes he may have committed while in office. Ford argued that the pardon was necessary to heal a deeply divided nation and allow the country to move past the trauma of Watergate. But for many Americans, however, the pardon had the opposite effect. It confirmed that the powerful were not held to the same standards of justice as ordinary citizens, that Ford had been chosen specifically to help Nixon with a pardon. And this deepened the cynicism and the distrust that Watergate had already fostered. While the fall of Nixon was a profound crisis of presidential authority, it also paradoxically offered a glimmer of institutional resilience. The relentless pursuit of truth by journalists like Bob Woodward and Carl Bernstein of the Washington Post, the televised Senate Watergate hearings that captivated the nation, and the Supreme Court's unanimous ruling forcing Nixon to release the incriminating tapes all demonstrated that, even in the face of an immense executive power, American institutions, freedom of the press, Congress, and the judiciary could in fact act as checks and balances against executive power. The system, however battered, had worked to hold the president somewhat accountable. Yet the sheer scale of the deception and the abuse of power at the highest level left an indelible scar. The long-term effect was not a renewed faith in these institutions, but a deeper, more pervasive public cynicism towards government and politicians in general, a cynicism that continues to this day, but it was a defining characteristic of the unraveling 1970s and beyond. Turning our focus to the economy, the post-World War II era had been one of unprecedented and seemingly boundless economic prosperity for the country. Fueled by its dominant manufacturing sector, a global economy recovering from war, and strong domestic demand often subsidized by the government, programs like the GI Bill, the United States became the quintessential affluent society. However, the 1970s delivered a series of economic shocks that shattered this illusion of endless growth and easy prosperity, forcing a painful reckoning with new global realities and underlying domestic structural flaws from earlier eras. One of the most significant long-term shifts was the beginning of what we call deindustrialization in the traditional manufacturing heartlands of the Northeast and the Midwest, an area that would come to be known as the Rust Belt. American industries, once the envy of the world, faced mounting competition from revitalized economies in Europe and Japan, nations ironically rebuilt with significant American Marshall Plan aid after World War II. Aging factories, coupled with the early stages of a transition towards a service-based economy, led to plant closures and widespread job losses in iconic American industries like steel and auto manufacturing, the backbone of U.S. manufacturing might for almost a century. Simultaneously, a new economic dynamism was emerging in the Sun Belt, states of the South and the West. Businesses were attracted to those regions because of lower labor costs. There was a weaker union presence, more favorable tax policies, and significant federal investment, particularly in military installations in the aerospace industry. This marked a major demographic shift in addition to the economic shift. And both of those shifts, more people and more money, led to significant political power shifting from the Northeast to the South in the United States. The most bewildering and distressing economic phenomenon of the 1970s, though, was stagflation, a toxic combination of economic stagnation, which is high employment and slow growth, with high inflation. This defied the conventional wisdom of Keynesian economics, which had guided post-war policy and generally assumed an inverse relationship between inflation and unemployment. The Misery index, a simple sum of the unemployment rate and the inflation rate, soared, capturing the daily economic anxieties of ordinary Americans. Real wages, for the first time in a generation, declined, and the promise of upward mobility that had been so prevalent from World War II, this cornerstone of the American dream, began to feel more and more elusive. These economic woes were dramatically exacerbated by an energy crisis. For decades, Americans had enjoyed abundant and cheap energy, particularly oil, which fueled its sprawling suburbs, large automobiles, and even energy intensive industries. This era of cheap energy came to an abrupt end in 1973 when the Organization of Arab Petroleum Exporting Countries, or OPEC, proclaimed an oil embargo against nations, including the United States, that had supported Israel during the Yom Kippur War. The impact of this embargo was immediate and it was severe. Gasoline prices nationwide skyrocketed, and long lines snaked around gas stations across the country became iconic symbols of the embargo itself. A second energy crisis struck in 1979, triggered by the Iranian Revolution and the subsequent disruption of oil supplies once again. These energy crises starkly exposed America's deep dependence on foreign oil and its vulnerability to geopolitical events far beyond its shores. The consequences were far reaching. A push for energy conservation, a sudden demand for smaller, more fuel efficient cars, which benefited foreign automakers, particularly Japanese companies like Datsun and Toyota, and a surge of investment into alternative energy research, though that was short lived. It was a significant blow to the American economic confidence and its sense of invulnerability. The economic crises of the 1970s definitively marked the end of America's unchallenged post World War II economic hegemony. The unique conditions that had fueled the affluent society, this dominant manufacturing sector in a war ravaged world, cheap and plentiful energy, and robust, often government stimulated domestic demand, had fundamentally changed. International competition was now fierce. Energy was no longer a cheap commodity. And the internal contradictions of a consumer economy, as warned by economists like John Kenneth Galbraith, were becoming painfully apparent. Galbraith had critiqued an economy where, quote, wants are increasingly created by the process by which they are satisfied, arguing that it was unsound and that it would lead to inequality and eventually instability. Stagflation and the resources anxieties of the 1970s seemed to validate his concerns and the sustainability of the post-war economic model overall. Deindustrialization was more than just an economic transformation. It was a profound social and cultural earthquake for the country. The factory jobs that vanished from the Rust Belt had been unionized, providing good wages, benefits, and a strong sense of community and identity for generations of working class families. Their disappearance led to not only economic hardship, but also a decline in union power, a hollowing out of industrial towns, and a deep sense of loss and betrayal. This created the fertile ground for new political narratives, often conservative, that blamed government overregulation, high taxes, or unfair foreign competition, contributing to the political realignments that would characterize the 1980s, the topic of our next episode. The concurrent rise of the Sun Belt also began to reshape the nation's political map, shifting power and influence southward and westward. The energy crisis in particular serves as a potent symbol of American vulnerability and the dawning awareness of the limits to United States growth. The sudden shortages, the soaring prices, these were visceral shocks to a nation accustomed for generation to abundance, forcing uncomfortable lifestyle adjustments and a new, often reluctant, consciousness about resource scarcity and the environmental impact. This challenged the deeply ingrained American optimism and the belief in endless material progress that had been the hallmark of much of the previous 25 years, contributing significantly to the decade's pervasive sense of unraveling. The era of the easy street, it seemed, was over. The 1970s witnessed a profound and contentious reshaping of personal lives as movements challenged traditional norms around gender, sexuality, and family. They gained momentum, asserting that the personal is political. These transformations were a direct continuation and expansion of the activism we saw take root in the 1960s, further unraveling the social fabric of the post World War II consensus. Second wave feminism surged into the mainstream, building on the intellectual and organizational foundations laid in the previous decade. Things we talked about: Betty Friedan's Feminine Mystique in 1963, the National Organization for Women founding in 1966, and the Equal Pay Act of 1963, the passage of the Equal Rights Amendment, the ERA, to the Constitution, and even reproduction rights. They all were crystallized in the 1970s. The landmark decision 1973 Supreme Court decision in Roe v. Wade legalized abortion nationwide and challenged pervasive sexism in the media, education, and the workplace. The movement also brought crucial attention to the issues like domestic violence and sexual harassment. Consciousness-raising groups became a vital tool, allowing women to share personal experiences and understand them not as individual failings, but as a product of sexism, powerfully captured by the slogan, "The personal is political." However, this wave of feminism now in the 1970s faced a significant and organized backlash. Conservative activists, most notably Phyllis Schlafly, mobilized opposition to the ERA and other feminist goals through her campaigns: Stop the ERA, Stop Taking Our Privileges. They argued that feminism threatened traditional family values. It would lead to undesirable social changes like gender-neutral bathrooms and women in combat. It would strip women of supposed existing protections. This opposition highlighted a deep cultural division sparked by the changing roles of women. The gay liberation movement, ignited by the Stonewall riots in New York City's Greenwich Village in 1969, gained unprecedented visibility and momentum into the 1970s. The riots, a spontaneous uprising against police raid on a gay bar, marked a turning point from quiet accommodation to militant resistance. The 1970s saw the first pride marches, the proliferation of gay and lesbian organizations, and a concerted effort and a push for the decriminalization of homosexuality and legal protections against discrimination in employment, housing, and public accommodations. This movement was a direct and defiant challenge to the oppressive atmosphere of the preceding decades, particularly the Lavender Scare of the 1950s and 60s. The gay liberation movements then of the 1970s fought to dismantle the legacy of fear and discrimination, demanding not just tolerance but full equality and human rights. The sexual revolution, which had begun to simmer in the 1960s, continued to reshape attitudes and behaviors in the 1970s. The widespread availability of effective contraception, particularly the pill, which had been approved in 1960, it had become widespread throughout later the 1960s, gave women greater control over their reproductive lives and contributed to changing norms about premarital sex as well as discussions of sexuality. Alongside these movements focused on human relationships and identity, a powerful environmental movement also came of age in the 1970s. Building on the concerns raised in the 1960s by figures like Rachel Carson, whose 1962 book Silent Spring exposed the dangers of pesticides, environmentalism became a major public and political force. The first Earth Day was celebrated in 1970, mobilizing millions of Americans to demand action on pollution and conservation. This public pressure contributed to the landmark legislative achievements, including the creation of the EPA, as well as the passage of the Clean Air Act in 1970 and the Clean Water Act in 1972. The energy crises of the decade further heightened public awareness to resource depletion and the environmental consequences of unchecked industrial growth and consumerism. These profound social and cultural shifts in the area of love, sex, gender, and the environment, they consciously represented a fundamental challenge to the post-World War II ideology of domestic containment. That earlier era had tightly linked the nuclear family traditional gender roles, the male breadwinner and the female homemaker, as well as societal conformity to national security in the fight against communism. Deviant, in quotation, sexuality, particularly homosexuality, was often equated with subversion and disloyalty. Second wave feminism, by questioning the inherent fulfillment of domesticity for women, and the gay liberation movement, by boldly asserting the validity of non heteronormative identity and relationships, directly attacked these core assumptions of the post war social order. This was a deep and often unsettling unraveling of prescribed roles and societal expectations. Interestingly, the push for environmental protection, while seemingly distinct, shared common roots with the other rights movements of the era. It involved a critique of unchecked industrial growth and corporate power, which were the hallmarks of the affluent society that had also perpetuated social inequalities. The post war economic boom prioritized production and consumption, often with no regard for environmental consequences, much as it had often disregarded or actively harmed marginalized social groups. John Kenneth Galbraith's critique of, quote, private opulence and public squalor could readily be extended to environmental degradation. Private profit frequently led to public environmental costs. The environmental movement, like the civil rights movement and feminist movements, called for greater accountability from powerful institutions and a reevaluation of social and societal priorities. The backlash against these movements, seen in the anti-ERA campaigns, the rise of anti-gay rights organizations, the resistance to environmental regulations, was not merely about a specific issues at hand. It represented a deeper cultural anxiety about the perceived loss of a stable, traditional social order and its established hierarchies. This defensive reaction against the unraveling of familiar norms and values fueled the growing political polarization of the decade and laid crucial groundwork for the rise of the new right and the culture wars that will continue to shape American society to this day. So, as we conclude our look at the 1970s, our textbook, if you remember, describing the 1960s, remembered that because so much changed and because so much did not. And this profound ambiguity undoubtedly extended and perhaps even deepened throughout the 1970s. Was it all simply an unraveling, a descent into crisis and chaos and decline? Or was the United States being rewoven in the 70s into something new, something more complex, more contentious, and perhaps, in the long run, more truly representative of its diverse peoples and challenging realities? The unraveling of the 1970s was, in many respects, a painful but maybe a necessary confrontation with the limitations and contradictions inherent in the American century's confidence at midpoint. The post-World War II era, for all its immense power and prosperity, was often characterized by an unquestioning belief in American exceptionalism and a tendency to overlook or suppress domestic inequalities and the complexities of global power. Vietnam, Watergate, economic shocks, oil, as well as the assertive rise of diverse social movements shattered this often complacent and self-congratulatory narrative. This unraveling was a loss of a certain kind of national innocence, but it also created an opening for a more critical self-assessment, a more honest reckoning with the nation's past and its future. The legacy of the 1970s, therefore, is not solely one of crisis and disillusionment. It is also a story of resilience, of adaptation, and laying the groundwork for new forms of activism, new identities, new debates that continue to shape 21st century United States. While trust in large centralized institutions declined, new grassroots movements and identity-based political organizations found their footing and gave strength. The profound questions raised in the 1970s about economic justice, environmental sustainability, the limits of American power, and the meaning of social equality remain central to our contemporary discourse. The decade forged a recognition of a more complex, multicultural, and contested America, even if the path to fully realizing that vision remained, and maybe still remains, fraught with challenges. The unraveling, perhaps, was also a revealing, a stripping away of old illusions to expose the difficult, ongoing work of American democracy. I'm Dr. G, and I'll see y'all in the past.